Stop motion animation is really beautiful, isn't it? Honestly, it's got to be one of the single most impressive artistic achievements that we as a species have ever made. It's a really magical thing, something that's so sophisticated and incredibly time-consuming to create that requires insane amounts of patience and dedication to what you're doing, but what, when all's said and done, is basically just the adult version of playing with toys, where it's no longer just the imagination of a child that's bringing the figures to life, but a shed load of sweat, hard work, and perseverance. And how's that for a metaphor about life? Hello and welcome to Morbid Moonlight at the Movies. My name is Alex and today we're going to be taking a look at a stop-motion anthology film that comes to us courtesy of Netflix, and it's a film that's called The House. Is it a horror film, you might ask? Well, initially I'd actually glossed over this one altogether because I thought that it was just an animated movie like a kids film or something. But then I was reading something that mentioned it in the context of actually being a horror film, and I figured that it was close enough to qualify. I think at least 2 of the 3 shorts definitely qualify as proper horror with a capital H, but basically, as I've said before, if you only watch nothing but horror films and you'll refuse to watch something that mightn't be 100% a proper legit horror film, then there is something fundamentally wrong with you. I'm only bringing this up because I have a channel where I talk about horror, but for normal people who don't have to worry about shit like that, then it doesn't really matter. You could probably convince me that this isn't horror, just as I could probably convince you that it is. But I'm here talking about it today for 2 main reasons. Number 1, I think it's a good, creepy anthology film that's definitely horror in my eyes. And number 2, more importantly, is that it's really, really good. So, The House is an anthology film that's made up of 3 stop-motion shorts that are glued together by the fact that they all revolve around a common theme, as the title suggests. There isn't a framing device, which I know kind of annoys some anthology purists, but I don't think that it's the sort of thing that's really going to drag this one down for you. I guess that it makes sense to tell you a bit about each story, because what we've got here is basically a review of 3 short films, and then I'll give you some kind of general thoughts at the end. So the first short is, and this is a bit of a spoiler to open with, by far the best of the 3 segments. The story follows a small, very poor working class family that are on the brink of a terrible poverty, only to be saved in the nick of time when a mysterious stranger arrives and makes them an offer, sell their house and move into a huge imposing mansion, where their every need will be catered to. Of course, like any bargain that you choose to make with a mysterious stranger, there are conditions and things are never as they seem. Story 1's got a very distinct, very odd style to it with the look of its characters. Whilst the settings and the world that they occupy is pretty photorealistic, the characters all look like this, with these big, round, doll-like soft heads and tiny features with little pinpoint eyes. It's a look that's kind of quirky and cuddly enough to look childlike and cute when it needs to, but it's also bizarre and off-kilter enough to also manage to look quite disturbing when it needs to. It's got that very ornate, beautifully lit and photographed style of something like the 80s Wind in the Willows cartoons that were just amazing to look at, and this story takes place in the past, which makes it all feel extra cozy and nostalgic and warm, and lends the characters that reassuring feeling of this all being like a cartoon from your childhood. That means that when things take a dark turn in this, you'll feel it all the more, it's more of a shock. It isn't as deliberately perverse and eager to offend as some adult animations, where you get a very kind of innocent and childlike animation style contrasting with very bleak, nasty storytelling, but it's a very chilling and atmospheric piece of work, this story, and I really love where it's coming from and what it's got to say for itself. It feels like a very dark fairy tale, which is something that works very well in this case, and it manages to make the house that it all takes place in feel huge and scary, this kind of twisting, changing labyrinth of dark passages and shadowy secrets that seems to get bigger and bigger as our characters are sucked deeper inside. There's something fairly inexpressive about the characters' faces, and in a weird way, I think it actually works in their favour because the voice acting and the overall kind of deep, dark atmosphere leads you to read more into these strange, totally out of proportion faces that somehow makes the terrible things that they're going through seem all the more disturbing, and the emotions just really seem to pop. There is some really unsettling stuff to this one, and it's definitely the best of the 3. I absolutely, no bullshit, love this one. It's totally, no doubt horror, really classic, darkly poetic horror with a point to it, beautifully directed, very atmospheric, and in my books, if I was rating this one segment on its own, then fuck it. It is a perfect 10 out of 10 for this one. I absolutely love it. So the first story featured soft toys with big heads and little button eyes. The next two stories both feature animal characters, with this next one featuring mice of a very human, up-to-date modern variety. We follow our lead mouse, who's got the voice of Jarvis Cocker, weirdly enough, as he works on doing up his house in order to sell it on and live out his dreams. He's presented to us as Mr. Show-Off, full of himself yuppie, keen to impress anyone close enough to listen to him, and straight away it's clear that we are meant to fucking hate this mouse.
Oh yeah!
As he entertains a party of prospective buyers, he attracts the attention of two particularly strange customers, who seem to be interested in his house and who stay the night, but then, as time passes, don't seem to be willing to commit to actually buying the place, and instead take root and begin to cause trouble of a very sinister, passive-aggressive variety, as mousy Jarvis Cocker's dreams begin to crumble around him. So there's a lot of cockroaches in this one, and little insects that turn up as pests, and the minute you see cockroaches in an anthology, you instantly think of Creepshow. Well, speaking for myself, I've never really liked that particular story in Creepshow that much anyway, the one with the germaphobe that gets trapped in his high-tech flat with a load of cockroaches. I actually think that this story is better than that. It's not as good as the first story in the house, because I don't think it's quite so clear in what it's doing. I mean, it takes time out to have a musical dance number at one point for no good reason other than it's a bit of fun, and it's a kind of messier story overall, but I do really like where it goes. It's more of this kind of surreal anxiety nightmare, and it relies more on kind of strangeness and this general feeling of things unravelling to get under your skin. It's got a brighter, breezier look to it, and the animation is a lot slicker and a bit more impersonal, but I think this one's good too, even if it's way more of an upper middle class horror story. I'd say it deserves maybe a 7.5 on its own. It's one of those ones that, because the lead character is kind of full of himself and the feel of it's a lot more detached and abstract than that brilliant first short, I was kind of turned off a bit whilst I was watching it, but once I started getting a sense of where it was all going, then I think I bought into it a bit more. And in hindsight, once you know where it's going, then I think you'll probably end up liking this one more as you think back on it. I do love the last shot of this one though, it's really nicely nightmarish. So, the last of the three stories sees us go from mice to cats. We follow our lead pussy this time, the owner of the house whose name is Rosa. Now, Rosa dreams of fixing up her house, restoring it to its former glory and going on to better things. And the problem is that she's only got two deadbeats living with her, and neither of them has got any money to pay their rent, which means that she can't fix any of the house's many, many faults. Oh yeah, and the world's flooded and the tides are rising. Very soon, Rosa's house is going to be underwater, but she doesn't let that get in the way of her dreams, even as her tenants plan to leave her and take off along the misty seas to seek a new life for themselves. Rosa is determined to see things through to the bitter end and continues to work diligently away in the face of the coming apocalypse. So the third story straight away looks absolutely beautiful. The misty seas that stretch off into the distance that surround this lonely house are an absolute work of art, and it's got this gorgeous, dreamy magic hour ambience to all that's very, very special. There's also some really powerful ideas in this one, and though it's probably the least horror of the three segments, personally I'd class this last story as not even horror at all, but who really cares, it is disturbing in its kind of melancholy nihilistic way. There's images that have got that strange, ethereal, dreamlike quality to them that I think is very interesting. It's also the story that I think that I've got the most problems with. On the surface, I'd say that it's better than the second story with the mice, just because it's not quite as grating, but in its own way, it's actually a little bit more annoying. I think the character designs on this last story are really nice, and I love the look of the cats. I think though that it's got the weakest voice cast of the lot, and I think that our lead playing Rosa just kind of ends up making a character that should be slightly brittle but likeable, instead just this horrible, strident, aggressive, irritating, sarcastic pest.
Take that boat apart, you! Oh, stop talking, you lunatic! Just take it down!
For this story to really work, You essentially have to buy into Rosa as a character and to feel for her plight. And I'm not saying that you need to love her, but ideally you don't want to be really annoyed by everything that she says. I think it's a pretty annoying characterisation that kind of drags things down, especially when the characters that offset her, who are supposed to be annoying but fun caricatures of kind of do-nothing hippies, are ultimately more enjoyable. They're ultimately more tolerable. I kind of like where it goes. It's got this kind of surreal dream logic to the ending that I think should work if you don't give it too much thought. Now, maybe I'm reading way too much into this one, but to me, the kind of point of this third story to me can only be that it's a really heavy-handed Marxist allegory. Now, I haven't read anything about the writers of this one, so I'm willing to be totally wrong about this. In fact, I'd love it if I was. I'd love to take it all as just this fun, dreamy bit of poetic sentimentality. But honestly, the Marxist thing just gets more and more blatant the more you think back on it. And I'm just not entirely sure that it fits, or that it's even a story that's worth telling. It's way too nakedly political for something like this, plus it doesn't seem to line up with the more sombre morality of the first two stories that had this kind of internal code of logic to them. There isn't really a moral to the last story, just this kind of point that it wants to get across, and to me, that's ultimately just a less satisfying type of story to tell. But it does look and feel beautiful, so I'd say that it's still at least probably about a 7 out of 10 just for what it is. So overall, I have to say that I think that The House is a really great anthology film. I really love stop motion animation. Maybe it's because it's such a genuinely magical and impressive technical feat when you consider how much work actually goes into animating each and every frame of something like this. Or maybe it's just because it reminds me of when I used to be a kid and I'd watch, Wallace and Gromit and Pat and Matt and Wind in the Willows and all the rest of it. Who really knows? But the bottom line is that an adult stop motion like this is always going to be something special for me personally. Now again, I haven't done any research about this, so I don't fully know whether or not it's all legit old school stop motion, or if it's been digitally augmented and just in the style of stop motion. Whatever, the aesthetic's still the same and I absolutely love it. Of course, it's really well made, and I think that, problems or not, the consistency is really there. There isn't a huge through line from story to story, and the theme is pretty loose, but these 3 shorts are all different enough that they go together and complement one another. It's rare to get an anthology that I think has got such a good average as this one does. There's usually at least one dud that kind of lets the side down, but even the one I like the least is still a thumbs up for me. The first story is certainly the one that is the best and the one that stands out the most, even though there's very memorable images in both of the other 2 shorts. I'd actually love to rate it overall higher just because that first story really deserves it. I mean, it's really that good, but I'm still going to come in at a very impressive 8.5 out of 10 for The House, because I think it's terrific and I would happily watch it all again. Honestly, I know it's not really that much of a compliment as we're only a couple of weeks in at the moment, but this is definitely the best film of the year that I've seen so far, and it will probably be the one to beat for a good while yet to come. That gorgeous stop-motion aesthetic, combined with very deceptively simple and childlike worlds that become progressively darker, filled with all sorts of surreal and disturbing images, because the boundaries of what you can do with animation are so much broader than they are with live action, where you've got to worry about effects looking good, really show you what the medium is capable of, and I think that all 3 shorts really come from people that have tapped into their innermost reserves of creative energy and managed to create a film that is, without sounding too ridiculously pretentious about it, a real work of art. Horror or not, you definitely should give The House a go. I really, really loved it.